Every single stage here is affected by a variety of human activities. From the very beginning, in terms of why the forest was converted and how long it remained in agriculture and what type of agriculture, to how long the fallow period is and what kind of fallows, as well as what's happening in already established secondary forest. This is a map of the land use in the region we're working in. The large green area in the center is Selva Biological Station in the north, and it is now continuous with Braulio National Park. So this forms a really large intact forest unit. However, it's, the borders of the region have been eroded over time, and you can see that it's now standing out as a peninsula with directly exposed to agricultural effects on all sides. And most of our study sites, 3 of them are within the La Selva Biological Station. Let's see, is this the... Here, this is La Selva. And I'll show you a map in a moment of our study areas. But you can see there's been a lot of conversion of forest to pasture and also to some large-scale banana plantations. And now a lot of the abandoned pastures are going into pineapple. So here's La Selva, and these are 2 secondary forest areas that we established in 1997. Each of these sites is a 1-hectare plot where we have marked all of the trees above 5 centimeters and very large numbers of tree seedlings and saplings, and we're following them over time. These are 2 younger areas that we established in 2005, and I'll be going into a little more detail on those. And then we established 2 mature forest sites in 2005 also, so we could kind of have some kind of reference point for comparing. And then we also have a couple of other sites off La Selva that we established in 1997. These were initially 15 to 25 years old when we established the plots, so they were already fully closed canopies. So I can't, there's a huge list that I could put up here in terms of factors that human effects on successional pathways, and probably indigenous people know far better than I do all the ways in which they can influence succession and actively do so. But in the ecological literature, you tend to not see this kind of information because they're focusing on the ecological processes that are important. So most of these effects that I'm going to be talking about directly affect the initial colonization status. So what trees or non-trees initially came into the site. And we are seeing very long-term legacies of that, the effects of that initial colonization. So some of these, for example, the effects of land use, in particular, the effects of invasive species and proximity to seed sources are going to be having their effect very early on in succession, and that will carry through for many, many years. Others, including remnant vegetation. The effects of hunting, I think, can also affect the processes way down the road. And actually, we're seeing effects of some of these well after the secondary forests have established. So it's not just describing what happens during the initial phases of abandonment. Okay. In many areas throughout the tropics, and I think this may be more typical of Latin America than Asia, but most of my experience is in Latin America. When pastures are created, many of the farmers leave quite a large number of trees that were in the original forest, as well as we see, in some cases, some regeneration of species in the pasture itself that are allowed to establish. Often these are very important species to the local community because of either their fruits or, in the case of Wolfia, they use the species for thatch, for ranchos. Sometimes they like to have some trees for shade for the cattle. There's a variety of different reasons. And some of these species are also illegal to cut, like the Dipteryx panamensis here. So there are regulations that protect them. So a variety of different reasons. That's a whole story in and of itself. But nevertheless, these have been denoted as living dead by Dan Jansen, a famous ecologist who kind of pointed out this is the end of the line for these trees. But in fact, if you look at what the future potential for them to contribute seed to future forests, they really are more like biological legacies. And here I just had a map showing these two young sites. The first part I want to talk about, these two young sites in Chilamate, they're both narrow strips that had been converted to pasture, and they were abandoned at the same time, around 1994, 1995. And one of them, Finca El Bejuco, is showing a very complete regeneration, no holes, very even canopy cover. And the one right next door, Juan Enriquez, is much more patchy, has some open areas. So immediately I was clued in that there might be something different. I tried to find out more about when they were with the land use. And in fact, the main difference that we now know between the two species has to do with the remnant trees. And this is just a graph showing that in terms of the species richness of both trees and tree seedlings, these two sites aren't different at all. So the species are pretty much the same in the two sites. So that's not explaining why they're showing different pathways of regeneration. But the real difference is in the fact that the Bejuco farm had 22 remnant trees in it, and composing 15 different species. So it already had some sources of seed as well as sites for animal dispersers to come and roost. And that has had a real cascading effect. Now we're looking at this forest 10 or 12 years later. And if you can see the basal area of the remnants here, this composes 28% of the total basal area of this forest, so it's a huge amount. Whereas in this site, there's only one remnant tree. It was a Welfia palm that I showed you a picture of earlier, and negligible contribution to basal area. The sites don't really differ in terms of the number of species of trees or even the density of trees. But when you look at the young regeneration, the site that had the remnant trees has a much higher number of tree seedlings, and these are just canopy palm and tree species, and a much elevated abundance of seedlings as well. So for both saplings and seedlings, there's a big influx in the site with the remnant trees. You can see this in more detail. These are two species of trees that are largely mammal dispersed, also some birds. And in these two cases, there was one remnant tree present in the El Bejuco plot. And you can see the much higher contribution of this species in terms of small trees, saplings, and seedlings in the site that had the remnant tree. And the same story here. And we even see this enhancement of bird and mammal dispersed species, even for species that don't actually have an individual in the remnant tree pool. So the advantage of having the remnant trees applies to a wide range of animal dispersed species. It doesn't require that any of those be of the same species necessarily. So I looked at which species of seedlings are more abundant in the site with the remnants, and you can see here there were 28 species in that category that had biotic dispersal by either birds or mammals. In many cases, these mammals are bats. And in only 3 of those species had wind or explosive dispersal mechanisms. In contrast, the site, there were 21 species that were more abundant in the site that didn't have the remnant trees, and that had a much greater representation of abiotically dispersed species. So the species with abiotic dispersal are favored in their abundance in the site without the remnant trees, and the biotically dispersed species were favored in the site with the remnant trees, and that's a highly statistically significant difference. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to pull the data together, because I found something pretty cool. The second part, I call Pigs in Heaven, and those of us who work at La Selva have noted over time that everywhere we go, we see peccaries and agoutis as well, but not as many agoutis as before. And noticing that all these peccaries all over the place, and they're doing all kinds of mucking around and eating seeds everywhere. Peccaries are important seed dispersers, but probably more relevant to this story is they are really important seed predators. they they eat the seeds. And La Selva has been protected from hunting for about the past 30 to 40 years, a fairly rigorous program of hired guards, and they patrol every night. So they really have kept the hunters out. There even are some jaguars at La Selva. And as a result, there's sort of been a boom, it seems to us, almost a boom in the population of peccaries. On the other hand, when we work at our sites off La Selva, we never see them. It's not that they're totally exterminated from the area, but they're very rare. And some of those areas do also hire guards, but it hasn't been nearly as rigorous a program, and there's been very strong hunting pressure on a lot of those properties, even though some of them are technically reserves as well. So we have a situation where some of our sites, we've got a lot of peccaries, a lot of seed predators around, and the sites outside of the reserve tend to not have these populations. So we looked at the data again, and I was clued into this looking at another data set from an earlier study in our sites, which I was amazed to see why we were getting so many more seedlings and saplings in our sites off of La Selva than our sites on La Selva, because we kind of expected the opposite. But in fact, the newer data sets also support this big difference. It's actually 2.9 times higher the seedling densities in these two secondary forest plots, which are in Chilamate, away from La Selva, compared to the two sites at La Selva. And we also see that same effect in the two mature forests as well. So there's a pretty strong evidence that the lower populations of these seed predators are allowing escape from predation for a lot of these tree seedlings. Now, one of the main principles of tropical forest ecology is that that's an important determinant or important mechanism for enhancing diversity of trees and forests. So who knows how this is going to play out? We now are getting data on survivorship of these species, so we might be able to see some species that are showing other sources of mortality due to higher population sizes. But I can't really tell you what the longer term implications of this are, but I think we're also seeing the pattern showing up in saplings and maybe in trees as well. So the third part is a very well-known pattern that is effects of different kinds of land use on the type of regeneration. And here in our system, we really have not too many variants here, but we do have sites that were pastured for 10 or more years versus sites that were cleared and then were never used for planting or anything, and they were just allowed to regrow right then and there. So we do have, or they were grazed for a very short period of time. So a study of my student Susan Letcher was looking at a large number of different secondary forest sites in the region, and these are for her 23 secondary forest areas. She did a census in a small area, but with a lot of smaller stems as well, and she looked at what is the effect of the age as well as the effect of the land use. And in terms of total biomass that was achieved on these secondary forests, there was only an effect of age. There was no effect of the land use, which is a pattern that is not seen in lots of other areas that perhaps have poorer soils. But in this region, we don't see a strong signal of the land use on biomass. But we do on species richness. And these two sites on the right, in each of these two age classes, the younger and the older, the sites that had heavier land use, that is, were pastured for longer periods of time, had fewer numbers of species in them. So there's evidence here. And there was not an age-use interaction. So this isn't due to an artifact of confounding these factors, which sometimes is a big issue with these kinds of studies. Fourth, and this is a little bit of an involved story, so I apologize for going through it very quickly. We have been doing a study of population genetics of one species of canopy palm, Iriartia, which is abundant from Central America all the way down through South America and Amazonia, a very important component of the forest. And very important in the mature forest at La Selva, and we've seen very successful natural regeneration of this palm in secondary forest. And one of our secondary forest sites became the object of study of one of Uzai's and one of my graduate students. Eriartia is dispersed largely by toucans, and toucans are wonderfully important for secondary succession because, number one, they eat large seeded species, which regenerate very well under forest cover, and they fly pretty long distances, and they're not afraid to fly across open fields or edges to cross borders of forests, and they're pretty fearless. So they are really delivering incredible numbers of seeds into second growth. And they love palms as well as some of the nutmegs. So what the toucans did was they dispersed. Uzai set up his project in this part of La Selva. The southern part of this is mature forest down here. This is just an enlargement of that. This is all mature forest. And then here's a border, an abrupt border. This is all second growth. And at the time he set this up, it was about 22 years old, second growth, which is just about the right time for a young Eriartia to grow up and reach reproductive maturity. So we found 157 trees in the second growth that were reaching reproductive maturity. We wanted to know where do those trees come from. So he did a DNA fingerprinting, and we were able to find the parents of those founders in the plot. And 76% of those had both parents from this region. What we didn't expect to find, though, was that 2 of those parents were the super parents, and they produced 48% of the genes that were found in this founding generation, which is a really strong founder effect. It's commonly found in colonizing populations, and we didn't expect that because we have a large number of potential parents here. For one reason or another, only 2 of them really were the abundant parents. Well, as a result, and because of the way toucans fly back and forth between trees, we discovered a lot of full sibs in this part of the plot, brothers and sisters in that first generation. So we got a little bit concerned in terms of what's going to happen to the seedlings. So next I'm going to show you some results. That's an Eriartia seedling. They're very cute. Don't get too lost in this slide. I just want to point out a few things. First of all, we found this is a measure of genetic dissimilarity, which roughly translates to genetic diversity. Okay, so higher on this scale means a greater diversity in the population. The old growth trees that we sampled had a higher diversity than the second growth population, and that's largely due to that reproductive dominance effect. When we look at the seedlings, this is the old growth seedlings that were sampled. They also have a higher genetic diversity compared to, much higher, compared to the seedlings that were near the edge, that were in that area where there were a lot of the full sib parents. So we see a continued genetic depression in the next generation. These are seedlings collected at 500 meters away from the edge, and lo and behold, they have restored the diversity in the seedlings, even though the trees were reduced. So for some reason, the genetic sources of the seeds in this farther away part of the plot were different than in the near plot. These are all complexities we just didn't know what to anticipate. And when you look at the parentage information, you find that in this far plot, a large number of those seedlings, in fact 40% in the faraway plot, were coming from parents outside the plot, compared to only about 15 nearby. And the number of the contribution from trees in second growth was very low. So they're getting their seeds from another source, primarily, outside of the plot. Well, when you look outside the plot, this is the kind of situation that you see. And look, there's an Eriartia out there. There are small patches of forests along streams. There's remnant trees. There's little tiny patches of forest dotting this entire landscape. And they're rescuing the genetic diversity of part of this population, which we never really realized. There's also a Welfia there too. So we think a lot of the same things are happening could be happening with other species, but we only have a story worked out for this one.
Who's rescuing the toucans?
Well, the toucans, collaboration with whoever left that tree out there. Yeah, little did they know. Well, the toucans are definitely doing an important job. And last, I want to talk about invasive species, because we have we ignored this problem a lot working in mainland Costa Rica, because invasive species aren't a problem for wet tropical rainforests, are they? Well, unless you're on an island, and we're not in Puerto Rico, so we don't have to worry about it. Well, in the Panama Canal Zone, this is a huge problem, and forests are not regenerating in large areas where they're trying to get them to regenerate because of this canal grass, which is huge, and you can burn it and it comes back, and you cut it and it comes back, and the only way you can get rid of it is to shade it out. And that requires a lot of labor and planting. Well, we didn't expect to have a problem in our sites either, and this is all Eduardo's fault, I have to tell you. One of our sites, which is located in Tirambina, it was initially part of a farm owned by Robert Hunter, an agronomist, and he was actually very important in the formation of OTS. And he was an experimentalist, and he liked to play around with all kinds of things on his farm. And probably somewhere around 25 years ago, he got some seed of acai from Cartier in Costa Rica, and he put in a little plantation. Well, little did I know that plantation was about 500 meters away from one of our sites that we established in 1997. So when we started doing our censuses, I noticed this euterpe. And there's only one native euterpe in our area. I know it well. And this looked a little bit different. So I took some pictures. I sent it to Andrew Henderson. I said, what is this? He said, I don't know. It doesn't look like anything that I've seen in Costa Rica before. And in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, acai, or a hybrid. Well, I didn't know for sure what it was, because only last year did they become reproductive. And we got a sample. One of my guys climbed that up, and we got some of the fruits down, and we brought them to La Selva, and I looked in the book, and then I went and visited the plantation, and sure enough, that's acai. So I went back in the data and plotted a perfect exponential growth function of acai in one of our plots. And this made me a little bit nervous, because actually now that I know that that's what I was seeing all that time, now I'm seeing it in several other sites, like in those Chilamate sites now. So now I'm saying, what do I do? Do I pull these out? And I'm not sure what they are. And we did cut the stems of these that were reproductive, because we don't want this to be spreading. And it will. It establishes perfectly under shade. It doesn't need an Amazon estuary to grow. So there we have it. So anyway, what is natural regeneration? This whole process really got me thinking. I use the term all the time, and now every time I say it, I kind of realize, what have I said? Essentially, human effects are being overlaid upon what is already a very highly variable and stochastic process due to the nature of succession. And listening to our discussions about human communities and how the initial conditions affect those and put in motion all of these changes, well, natural communities follow exactly those same issues and constraints, and things that happen very early on that affect the trees that end up growing there have long-term legacies in terms of how that forest is going to develop. And of course, we're seeing that played out now in mature forests and thinking, what is it that happened 200 years ago that's why we have, all of these species in here. And I think we really have to broaden our view of succession to incorporate all of these effects together. And there's no way, to ever really tease it apart. I just don't think we can do that. But it's kind of fun to play around with it. Thanks.
Do we have any questions? Or is lunch back?
Oh, sorry, I delayed lunch. That was just a fantastic study and very, very interesting. I just have a couple of questions, sort of methodological. One is, how did you establish the land use histories for these plots? Maybe I missed it at the beginning or something, but were you there to observe it? Do you interview people? How do you establish it? And then the other thing I was looking at is you're comparing biodiversity between plots. But if you shift the scale, that is, you cover a larger area, you're looking at a mosaic of plots on numerous successional pathways, creating over a larger area, even greater diversity. So I wonder if you've been able to look at that.
Well, there's a reason why we restricted our study to the one area, because once you do get farther and farther away, then you start getting into soil differences, elevational differences, and all those affect succession. So it's important if you're trying to tell a story about how about a process in one area to keep it spatially delimited. As far as the land use, some of these sites I know well because I walk through them as pastures. Others, we have a lot of information from the people who were involved in the land conversion or photos. It wasn't all that long ago, so we have a lot of aerial photos as well.
And then to follow up, in terms of hunting and other activities that continue as the succession is taking place, how do you monitor that?
Well, they don't even have good monitoring of that at La Selva, of the mammals. So this is a real problem that we're discovering because OTS doesn't have its own scientific staff. So they get what they get. There's anecdotal information. There's been a couple other studies in the region, and they did publish some information about sightings and showed that they never see, in that Tirambina area, they never see peccaries. And we're out there a lot, and we never see them. But it's all anecdotal information at this point.
Thank you. Let's break for about 45 minutes for lunch.